Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 23rd of January. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, world braces for fallout from looming European financial meltdown, and Glass-Steagall reality check. Markets crash faster than they rise. So, world braces for fallout from looming European financial meltdown. Craig, there are three massive events that are happening in Europe as we speak, effectively. They're coming one after the other.
And behind those events, Robbie, you have the collapse in oil prices by over 50%.
Yes. So keep that in the back of your mind, the collapse in oil prices, which has global consequences. Now, the three particular things we're going to say, though, hopefully the viewers will be familiar with all of them, but we'll give you some information on them. They are: the Swiss have cut the peg of their currency, the Swiss franc, to the euro. They just cut it last week without warning, and that's had consequences. Today, the European Central Bank has announced 1.1 trillion euros of money printing, effectively. They're going to print that much money to pour into the European economy to prop up the euro. It's called quantitative easing. And the third one is, this is a Friday as we're doing this, Sunday, the Greeks have an election. And at that election, it is expected that you'll see a massive popular revolt against the euro and against what they call the troika, that has imposed the brutal austerity that's killed a lot of Greeks to keep the euro propped up. So let's just talk about those three events. The issue with the Swiss has sort of set the ball rolling, right? Now, what happened was, when the European debt crisis erupted, the Swiss got worried. Now, Switzerland is a neutral country that's an island inside Europe, effectively. So they're not only are they neutral in that sense, they're not part of the euro either. So you've still got the Swiss franc as a currency, and of course Switzerland has a big banking sector and whatnot. The Swiss were concerned with the Greek debt with the European debt crisis centred in places like Greece and Italy and Spain, and that the decline in the euro would see the Swiss franc go up sharply against the euro. And when something like that happens, what you export out of your country to your customers becomes more expensive.
Well, because they're producing $1.1 trillion, Robbie, basically, think about that of flooding the markets with euros, 1.1 trillion. What does that do to the currency? It actually weakens the currency because you've got so much more money chasing the...
Well, and that's what, but see, the Swiss were already worried about a currency decline, which is why they pegged their currency to the euro so that their currency didn't go up really sharply in relation to the euro. But with knowing the European Central Bank was about to announce this 1.1 trillion, the Swiss thought, the Swiss action basically is saying this is going to so devastate the euro, this is going to cause hyperinflation across Europe. We can no longer abide by that policy, so we have to take off our peg to the euro. And in doing that, that's had all these consequences straight away. I'll just mention two of them. A whole bunch of European banks have declared foreign exchange losses just in a week, Craig, of $2 billion. Because, of course, they had all these forex bets on involving, the Swiss franc is a widely traded currency. They had all these forex bets, and this emergency decision by the Swiss just pulled the plug on those, right? And so that's massive, just in a week or so. Feel sorry for the poor people of Poland. There's 500,000 Polish mortgage holders who have woken up in shock because their mortgages were denominated in Swiss francs. And what that has meant for them is, by the Swiss decoupling, straight away the Swiss franc went up 20% against the euro. These Polish families, that means all their mortgage payment, what they owe on their mortgages and their mortgage payments have jumped up 20% straight away. 20% in one instant.
It's not just Poland, Robbie. It's also places like Romania that have, they're taking. What you find is actually the central banks are starting to do things like impose interest rate freezes. Which is central bank operations to protect people against these currency the volatility of the Swiss franc currency. And I find that very interesting, because what is the actual solution here? It's not going in this direction of literally flooding the market with money. It's what we've always said. The only solution to this is to go back to a full Glass-Steagall separation of the banking system, to separate out the legitimate banking system, which does need to provide money for mortgages, from the highly speculative forex trading, derivatives trading, and everything else.
Well, it's because there's so much bad debt built up from that other activity that you've just described there, that the European Central Bank has made that decision because they're trying to prop that bad paper. They call it paper in the banking. They're trying to prop that bad paper up.
They're trying to buy the bonds that are in the banking system that's causing the problem of those banks, instead of saying, that
when they should be scrapping
it. Just writing it off. Okay, at the end of the day, that's what. At the end of the day, the real people that are going to suffer this are going to be the householders, the mum and dads, again, right, from this particular policy where the Swiss are trying to protect them.
And it's interesting you say that, Craig, because what we're seeing now is people are weighing up different types of suffering. So, for example, when you look at the consequences of the Swiss decoupling their franc from the euro, this has had a devastating consequence instantly, but it shows you the fact that the Swiss are more worried about the consequences of not doing that in the face of this money printing that's going on, right?
Yeah.
Just in terms of the money printing itself, we're talking 1.1 trillion they've announced, which is 60 billion euros a month. They're going to buy, as you said, the paper off the banks. And so the whole purpose of buying the paper is just to justify the transaction. The money itself that the central banks will use is created money. It's not printed physically, it's electronically printed money. They just invent it on the spot, and they give it to them and say, give us something in return, and they'll get this bad paper from the banks in return. And then the banks have this new money that they can do stuff with. What are they going to do with it? They're going to go out and gamble with it, because there's no conditions on the banks to put it into anything productive or whatever. And so this is, there's a whole bunch of experts that are saying, look, we've had $5 trillion worth of money printing from the United States since 2009. We're getting trillions in terms of money printing from the Japanese central bank. We've had stacks of money printing from the Bank of England. Craig, right now there's something like 7 central banks around the world that are actually engaged in this kind of money printing, but this EC, European Central Bank operation, is the big one. And at a certain point, if you keep printing money electronically, as I said, but it's not productive, you're not putting it into something productive, you cannot not get hyperinflation, right? That's going to be the bottom line. So let's just take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue this discussion. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing world braces for fallout from looming European financial meltdown. And Craig, we're talking about the 3 big events that's happening right now, starting with the Swiss decision to cut their currency pegged to the euro, the European Central Bank's announcement today that they're going to print 1.1 trillion euro to give to the European banks to prop up all their bad debt bets that they've made on derivatives, etc. And the third event, which we'll talk about now, is on Sunday, the Greeks are going to an election. And this has the entire global financial system in a state of panic. Because just to recap, when the debt crisis erupted in Europe, it was centred in Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. They called them the PIIGS, the pigs countries. And of course, of those countries, the worst in terms of debt per capita and debt as a percentage of GDP was Greece, right? So Greece for 4 or 5 years has suffered through brutal austerity. You've got pensions that have been absolutely slashed. People have been expected to live on half of what they lived on before. But while things like the pensions are getting slashed, healthcare is getting slashed. There's been so much carnage in the public health system in Greece. People have been dying en masse. You got suicide rates have gone through the roof as a result of this devastation of the Greek economy. And you got a world, Craig, that sat back and go, tut, 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 these lazy Greeks that retired at age 21, and they didn't pay their taxes, it's all their own fault. And of course, that most of that is entirely untrue.
Well,
right? It's just a line.
Let's cast it in something that people may cringe a bit when we keep talking about this on this show, Robbie. And this is a policy of deliberate population reduction. from the 7 billion we've got now down to below 1 billion. Now, I read a report from The Guardian yesterday that was reporting on a guy that was saying people are stupid or ignorant if they have families, if they have kids. Now, if you've got a society that now believes that having a family is insane, that's population reduction.
Yep.
That is the policy of the British Empire. Its monetarist arm through the Wall Street, London, its extensions, its satrapies like the European Union and so forth. That is actually, this is an intentional policy of population reduction.
Yeah, because what austerity in Greece has said is, okay, we know this is killing people, but the system, our system, monetary system is more important than their lives,
Yep.
so let it kill people.
And that's what you're getting now. The people are saying, oh, you're stupid if you have families. How does a nation survive with that sort of attitude amongst the desperate people? It can't.
No, exactly.
But that's the intention. This is not an undeliberate policy. And I mean, even Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, came out and said, look, debt is debt, it's got to be paid. End story. There's no excuses, it's just debt.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because Craig, I want to give one example. I went to a conference in Germany in October, and people can see on our website I addressed it and we reported on this show. But at that conference was the leader of one of the Greek parties that this weekend is expected to do quite well. There's two leading parties that could probably win this election as a coalition, and they are completely anti-EU and Euro and Troika. And by that I mean they're fully prepared if they win and they do not get the European Union to back down. They'll say, okay, we're getting rid of the Euro and going back to the drachma, which frankly would be far better for them. They're propping up the Greek people. This is austerity we're talking about. They're not just propping up Greece's finances. They're propping up Europe's. They're being killed to prop up Europe's finances by propping up the euro. Anyway, this politician gave an example of what Greece is dealing with in debt. So Christine Lagarde said it's debt. It's got to be paid. He gave one example. In 2009, Greece was sold a CDS deal, which is a credit default swap deal. It's a derivatives deal. On a borrowing, Greece had borrowed, in this one transaction, they'd borrowed 1.3 billion euro, right? And it was covered by this credit default swap. In 12 days, because this credit default swap went bad, in 12 days, that 1.3 billion debt had ballooned to 27 billion debt. Just off the chart, out of all proportion. That's the nature of the derivatives gambling sickness that the world has been hit with for a long time now, that has trapped countries like Greece. That's why that debt's unpayable. That's why it's got to be forgiven. So it's got to be just written off. So these two leading parties in Greece, what's got Europe really panicked is they are putting forward a proposal as a solution which is eminently reasonable. And the reason it's eminently reasonable is because there's a precedent. After World War II, when Germany had been forced to surrender, Hitler was gone, it was on its knees, etc. There was a conference in Europe where Germany's debts were written off. They'd learned the lessons of the mistake of the Versailles Treaty from World War I when Germany was hit with a massive debt. This was different. Germany's debts were forgiven after World War II, right? And that is what led to the German economic miracle that we now call it today, this massive revitalising the German economy after the devastation of World War II. Well, these two Greek parties are saying we need a similar conference in Europe today. That's what they're suggesting, something that has a precedent. And of course, the central banks and the bankers are like, no. You've got Christine Lagarde's actions there. But the Greeks are saying if this doesn't happen, then goodbye euro. And if the Greeks pull out of the euro, it could be the beginning of the end of the euro.
The reality, Robbie, is that this is the only choice that they're going to have in the end. This debt is unpayable. So what are you going to do? Keep tacking it on and trying to pay it when it's actually unpayable? The political solution, which sounds like it's coming from these parties in Greece, is to say, look, the reality is, what have we got? We've got people who need to be fed, housed and clothed. We've got an economy of sorts that produces a certain amount. What you have to do is go back and match that economy with a system that services the economy first and foremost.
Yep.
That means going back to a monetary system that's based upon serving the economy, not the other way around of an economy serving a monetary system. That means you go to a sovereign currency, go back to a sovereign currency, go back to a sovereign banking system, and you have to be highly regulated here. I mean, it was no accident that when Glass-Steagall was brought down, that Roosevelt held a 3-day banking holiday, shut the banks down, sent out his inspectors, had a look and see which banks were able to be resurrected, and then came back with very strict Glass-Steagall type regulations, which they had to comply with. Now, that's what we have to do here in Australia, and every sovereign nation has to realise that if you're going to get involved in the global casino of monetary speculation, then at the end of the day you're going to get screwed. That's what's happening with Greece. Greece is going to happen to every single country, and I think that's the realisation that's happening now after 5 years of this brutal austerity in Greece and in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere. People are saying, well, there must be an alternative.
And there is. So everyone pay particular attention to the Greek elections this weekend. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk more economics on the price of oil and housing. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, Glass-Steagall reality check. Markets crash faster than they rise. So, Craig, officially, woohoo! Good news. Petrol in some places in Australia is under $1 a litre. And I yesterday in the Sydney airport, sitting waiting for my plane, I noticed a lady playing with her smartphone beside me, looking through her photos, and she'd taken a photo, and I've heard this is common, she'd taken a photo of a petrol station board, the sign out the front of the petrol prices, right? Because this is historic, 99 cents a litre again, and who knows where it's going to stop. Though I do think there is a scandal about the fact that rural people are still paying way too much. Anyway, this is on the back of a plunge in the oil price by more than half in just 6 months, right? Now, it's a very good lesson about markets in general, because this segment's not really about oil prices, though we'll talk about that a bit. It's going to be about house prices, because people have to, and we put out a press release on this, people have to know that you can believe all the hype you like. Think about what you're being told about house price in Australia, that it's all supply and demand and blah, 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 that they'll never come down. Well, before this last 6 months, who would have thought that we were going to see petrol prices like this again? I mean, we'd become used to $1.50, right, as a standard thing. So let's actually have a look at what happened with the oil price, because it was only a bit over 10 years ago. 2004 was when oil was at $30 a barrel. 2004, and it was in that year it started to hike. And from 2004, it went from $30 to around April 2008, it was $148 a barrel. So that's a massive increase, and we're thinking, you're hearing about peak oil, right? The end of oil production. You're hearing all this rubbish, and it was always rubbish. And then it's the Gulf War and all this kind of thing, and none of it was ever true. When a market goes up that fast, there's something else going on, basically.
It's price collusion. People have to understand that the oil companies operate as a cartel. There is no such thing as one oil company. So this is all collusion, and it's done at a political level as well. And
there was we don't have a lot of time to analyse this, but just to give some cursory things that the people can look it up. EIR did studies this at the time. The big 7 oil companies merged into big 4. They had a lot of debt, and they had to try and find ways to raise the price to pay off their debt. At the same time, for the first time ever, the British in 2002-03 allowed a market in oil futures to start in the UK, where non-oil companies were allowed to buy oil futures, because before then only oil companies could buy oil futures. And once that happened, all this extra money came in to speculate in the price of oil, and that was driving it up, things like that, right? But I just want to emphasise it was never supply and demand for a couple of reasons. For the Saudis, for example, their actual cost of production didn't go above $5 or $10 a barrel. It was never an issue for them. And even, that's the Saudis, and everyone goes, oh yeah, that's the Saudis. Well, even in the BHP, biggest Australian company, in its annual general meeting in 2008, at the time when oil was $148 a barrel, the head of BHP bragged at its AGM that BHP was producing it for $11 a barrel, right? So it was never supply and demand. And there was never cost of production, and it's never supply and demand, because otherwise it could never have come down this fast the way it has, right? There's nothing actually stopping it from coming down. Now, I have to make this point though. What set off this collapse was a political action. The Saudis set this off as an attack on Russia, because it's not that Russia has, like places in America, has become dependent on this higher price. At the higher price, they could produce more from harder to get places, etc., that did involve more money. And unfortunately, the Russian economy became dependent on that. And as an attack on the Russian economy, the British and Saudis set off this. But even though they set it off, Craig, I don't think they can control it now. Well, it's virtually in free fall.
That's clear. I mean, the fact is now they've not only set off the price of oil, Robbie, but all the fracking coal seam gas enterprises are collapsing.
Yep.
We've got supporters who can't find work in that.
140,000 Texans are being laid off from the oil industry.
From the oil industry straight. Then you've got the huge Gorgon gas fields in the northwest of Western Australia. I mean, the price of LNG is tied to oil, and a lot of these projects are becoming unviable now because of the price of oil. So you've got huge populations of workers that are going to be unemployed right across the world, which begs, what's this going to do to the economy as a whole?
No, exactly. Now, there's a financial grenade that's set to go off here as well, which is derivatives. I'll just explain that using an example. Think about the viewers. You might have been tempted, we've discussed it as jokingly here. Let's get a 44 gallon drum and fill it up with petrol, right? Because, how long can these prices last? And you can do that, and that's like a little bit of a bet. You're betting on the price might go up again, right? Well, derivatives traders, they're the kind of bets they do. They'll go and buy the rights to a stack of oil and say, I'm going to hold that until the price goes up and then I can sell it. So there's a lot of such bets that over the time have been made that have been just smashed by this collapse in the last 6 months, right? Absolutely smashed. And so all that's percolating through the system now. There's someone's estimated $20 trillion worth of such derivatives bets in oil, right? That's percolating through the system, and that's going to have a huge impact. So anyway, that's oil. So for Australians, you've got to think, okay, that's what an oil market can do. Well, the point is that's what any market can do. That's what happens to stock markets. That's what happens to all kinds of things. So let's just look at housing, because this is something we've talked about a lot, Craig. We've had this massive spike, like oil, in the price of housing, which started in 2000, a bit earlier than the oil price, and it just shot up many, many times, 4 and 5 and 6 times the housing prices increased, right? We're told it's supply and demand. Well, that's provably false. The population from the year 2000 to the year 2010 went from about 20 million to 23 million, right? So that's a percentage increase, whereas house prices quadrupled and quintupled and stuff like that. So that was never the case. So you think, okay, if that's not the issue, what if the house prices do go down?
Well, that's a holocaust for the banks, because their asset values are based upon the mortgages.
Yes.
As we've said before, this is why they want to get into bail-inable bonds and try and bail themselves out using taxpayers' money, no matter how. But I think the point's been made very clear, Robbie, is that there is no reason why housing prices can't fall through the floor. Just because we think it's been a holy grail for so long, just like oil prices or the stock market, markets crash.
Yep.
And that's about as much as you can say at the moment. Why they crash, how they can crash, there's multiple different ways, but the fact is markets crash.
Yep. So listen, as I said, we've got a press release on this. Go and read it. But the point is, you need a Glass-Steagall system to handle the consequences of that so it doesn't destroy people. But I will say on the bright side, if the housing market crashes, housing will be affordable again. But that's it for the CEC report. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.